little boxes on the hillside. Little boxes made of ticky-tacky, little boxes on the hillside. Little boxes all the same. There's a pink one and a green one and a blue one and a yellow one, and they're all made out of ticky-tacky, and they all look just the same. And the people in the houses all went to the university, where they were put in boxes and they came out all the same. And there's doctors and lawyers and business executives, and they're all made out of ticky-tacky, and they all look just the same.
Alexa, stop. Okay. So that was a song about conformity. I know it's a strange song, but if you want to listen to the whole thing, it's an interesting song. So today we're going to talk about prejudice and stereotypes. First of all, I want to start with the premise that there is no such thing as a person that's not prejudiced. We all have prejudices. We are brought up in a culture that teaches us prejudice. We're to some degree wired to be prejudiced. And so people that are less prejudiced actually are a little more aware that they are prejudiced and are working on it. So we'll start from that premise. But I want to make the distinction between prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination. Okay, so prejudice is really what we use to refer to the emotional component, the dislike. Stereotypes are overgeneralized beliefs. They are all like this, okay? And discrimination is the behavioral component, okay? So prejudice is emotion, stereotype is what you're thinking, and discrimination is how you treat someone differently because they belong to some group. And so there's really kind of several sources for prejudice. One that pops to mind, of course, immediately is social. We grow up in families that introduce us to different types of prejudices. Television teaches us different kinds of prejudice and so forth. School, religion, it's everywhere. So those are the social sources. There's also, one might argue, emotional sources for prejudice. The research actually finds that people with lower self-esteem tend to be more prejudiced because it's a way of boosting their self-esteem to tell themselves that they are better than someone else. So people with high self-esteem don't need to turn to that mechanism, so they don't show it as much. Also fear. We tend to fear those which are different. We might actually be a little wired that way. It makes some evolutionary sense that we are afraid of what is different, and what is the same is considered safe. There's a really interesting video on YouTube that I didn't post, but if you get a chance, it's called Morality in Babies. And the second half shows how babies immediately have a preference for those who share similarities with them rather than those who are different. And then another one is kind of a cognitive aspect. The world would be really, really complicated if we didn't think in terms of categories. If every time we had a shirt that was made of a different fabric or was a different color, we had to come up with a whole new label name for it, it would just be overwhelming. And so categories help us organize the world and make it a more navigable place. The problem comes when we apply those same categories to people. Shirts don't mind if you don't recognize their unique individualism, but when you do that to people, we run into trouble. And so those are kind of some of the underlying factors. Some other things in here that we'll talk about is scapegoat theory. Scapegoat theory, whenever we're in times of stress, we look for someone to blame. It gives us a sense of emotional relief, and it's usually a group that has less power than us and cannot retaliate sufficiently. So we find some safe target to take anger or fear out on. The other race effect is interesting and depressing. So it is that the fact that when we are trying to identify people of other races, we're just not as good as we are when it's our own race. And so that's what we mean by the other race effect, is that we find our own facial features a lot easier when it's our own group than a different group. And it's also why in eyewitness testimony in criminal trials, if someone from outside the group, an eyewitness from outside the group they're talking about is testifying, their testimony is very suspect because we're just bad at it. All right, so there's implicit versus explicit prejudice. Implicit is really unconscious. Explicit is more conscious. So, we've gotten to this point in our culture where we don't often express prejudice explicitly. But we're talking about people who are aware of and comfortable with the fact that they don't like certain people because they belong to certain groups. Whereas really we all suffer from implicit prejudice of different kinds. In fact, let me urge you to test yourself. There's a website, if you just Google implicit Harvard, you'll find this website where you can test your biases towards different groups. And it's measuring more of an unconscious bias, depending on how you react to different words and so on and so forth. And so we get wired from a very early age with these kind of implicit biases. I gave you that example in class about the man and his son out for a car drive. They get into a car accident. The father's immediately killed. The son's rushed for a hospital for emergency surgery. The surgeon walks in and says, "I can't operate. It's my son." It's that implicit prejudice that really makes that a difficult question for us to answer. We just get wired to think of surgeons as male. All right, in-group, out-group. In-group is the group you identify with. Out-group is the group you don't identify with. And we fundamentally, automatically, hardwired prefer our own group, whatever group that is. Okay? They've done these studies where I can randomly assign you to two groups. Let's say we're in class and I randomly assign you to two groups. I can tell you that the assignment was random, but you're still going to believe your group is the good group. You're still going to have an emotional preference for your group. We're just wired to like the group we're in, partly because we like ourselves so much. And so if we're in that group, it must be an awesome group. We have a really strong self-serving bias, a really strong preference for the self. Which I just talked about, in-group bias, that preference for the self. Out-group homogeneity effect is the tendency, and it really relates back to this concept of stereotypes. It's the idea that we see, what happened there? It's the idea that we see the out-group is all the same, okay? So we see, if you look at your group of friends, you're like, oh, they're so unique, they're such individuals. But when you identify maybe a different clique in high school than your own, you see them as all having a lot in common, as being very similar to each other. So homogeneity means sameness. Aggression and causes of frustration-aggression principle, and how that relates to prejudice. That when we have a goal that is blocked, that's when aggression increases, and that's what I mean by frustration. Your goal is blocked. So, for example, how this relates to prejudice, is that if you look at times historically when employment is bad, you will see a dramatic attention paid on immigration, because we suddenly see the goals of high employment being blocked, and we turn our hostility towards, again, this relates to scapegoat theory as well. We turn aggression towards those we think are blocking our goal, other people getting in the way of getting our jobs and so forth. Okay. And then how do we decrease prejudice? The research has generally found that you have to set up a situation where there are norms of equality, where there's this expectation that everyone will be treated the same and that everybody is the same. You have to have interdependence. You have to have situations where people of different groups have to rely on each other to get a common goal that they all want. You have to have a lot of contact between groups, which is sometimes difficult to establish. And you have to have situations where really everyone in the situation is treated as an equal status. It's interesting if you look at the two good examples you can think of this in society, at least related to race, not so hot on gender stuff, are sports and the military. So let's take the military. They have very delineated status. They have norms of equality. Everyone's green, right, is the saying. And there's incredible interdependence, right? You have to rely on each other to stay alive. And there's a lot of really close contact in terms of housing and so on and so forth. And so if you look at racial attitudes among military members, they're actually better than almost any other group. There's a lot more interracial marriage among military members and so forth. And sports teams, if you've ever watched Remember the Titans, that's a great example of those elements in play. And if that's something you could watch while you're sitting at home. All right, I'm going to stop there and we'll come back and finish off this chapter. All right.